22 of DAC Trade Show Manager Setup. We'll navigate over to the Trade Show menu by taking option 3, then 22, then option 20. And we'll cover a couple of things in this session. We'll touch a little bit on vendor grouping again, also item grouping within a booth, and indicate some things that happen when you use points instead of allowances or off-invoice discounts. So let's start by just doing a quick refresher here. Let's take one option to go to Trade Show, and then I do a B beside my active trade show that we used in the last session. Our booth number 3 is set up for as a vendor group instead of an individual vendor, so it's multiple vendors involved. And to refresh your memory, put a V beside that booth. I can see the vendors that are involved. Of course, you can add and delete vendors out of that grouping from here. One thing I did want to point out while we're still on here is you can give the group a name. If you don't give it a name, it's just it will contain the text that just says vendor group, and that's all it will say. But to give it a name, when you first set a group up, it prompts you for a name, but if you want to change it or you didn't enter a name in the beginning, if you put a G beside a booth that has a vendor group, it brings you to a place where you can change the name. So to be whatever you want it to be. So you see that changes it, but because that change gets reflected on some recaps and things of that nature. So that's how you would do that. And just to finally touch on one last thing for vendor grouping, if I go to the purchasing menu, navigating through some stuff here, and then work with vendors, you'll notice an entry up here at the top, Trade Show Manager Group. So if you want to come from this side, if you happen to be over looking at vendors and you want to see how things are grouped, if you do key a group number in, you can see the vendors that are part of that group. So back again once to our group 100. If you do a 2 to edit a vendor, you'll see you can change that Trade Show Manager grouping directly in here. It is an input field. So just as another way to get to it, you can get to it directly from within Trade Show Manager, but that's just another way if you happen to be over in the purchasing side of life and need to look at things. So I'm going to go back now to our Trade Show menu. So that's a little bit about that. So let's now look at another type of grouping, and this is a booth item grouping. So if I do a B beside my show and come down here, so I've added a couple more items in under my Hershey booth, which was booth number 1. So I'll do an I beside that to show the items. Now if I want to come in here and say, for instance, I wanted to affect the sequence in which items appear. The default sequence is they sort down by vendor number and then by item description. So that's how they'll appear in the booth and on a printed document. That's the default setting. But if you want to change that the sorting method a little bit, obviously this Reese's Fast Break is going to sort, an R comes after H in the alphabet. So let's pretend that we want to drive this Reese's Fast Break up to the top of the stack of items listed for the booth. So you have group numbers you can use, and each booth has its own unique set of group letters that can be assigned. So if you use Group A in booth 1 might be one thing, and Group A in another booth is a completely independent thing. So it is by booth. If I put an A here by this Reese's Fast Break, you'll see that my group is not defined. We're doing this to validate and make sure that people have some form or some a plan in place, if you will. So if I press F10, I can set up a booth grouping. So let's do that. F10 brings me to a screen that looks like this. Now you'll want to put your booth number and the group number, and then you have the opportunity to define it. So I'm going to say booth number 1, and I want to define Group A. So it sees that that's not defined yet, so I'm going to say yes, I do want to add that. So now I can come down here and I can say let's just say something like this. Meaningful, you would do something more of a practical entry in your setup. So I could add, now I can say that is an A item. If I want to put all these kisses together, maybe I want them to fall somewhere else. So let's add another group before I put them in here. So let's say booth number 1, group B. I'm going to add that. Give it a description. Something that makes sense to you, just to pull things together. So now I can go put a B beside all of these entries. So there. So that what will happen now is when booth listing appears, the Reese's Fast Break will appear first, followed by the Hershey Kisses. They're in group B, and then everything else will sort down after those by vendor, by item description. So that's a way to control that. So that's a little bit about grouping. Now we can take it to a different level of information on the booth grouping if we're operating under points as opposed to an off-invoice allowance type scenario. You can do that. I also wanted to show you while we're in here, before I go make another change, is the fact that you can set something up as a fixed price. So it might be an off-invoice allowance if you're set for that type of mode, or it could be a special show price. And just as informational, if you put a special show price in here and say it's, for instance, it's a tobacco type item, this would be a special price for a tobacco item, a fixed price, and then it will go ahead and calculate out and display on the booth for the customer if there are any applicable tobacco taxes or stamp taxes for cigarette items, something of that nature that comes. So that does get laid on and applied afterwards. So this would be like a starting point base that you would work from. So I just thought I needed to mention that. And it will distinguish on the booth entry. You'll see all this stuff when we actually do a session showing what the booth operator sees in the web browser. So that's a little bit about that. I'm going to jump back over here. I'm going to come to the main option here. Option number 1, I'm going to press F20. I'm going to jump over here and I'm going to switch over to points instead of allowance or cents off discount to show you some differences here. So I'm going to go back down, drill into booth, and I'm going to look at items within the Hershey booth. And now under a points scenario, you'll notice now there's another field that's opened up here. So I can actually put points in. And so that would be every time they buy 1 unit, they would get X amount of points. So say, for instance, on this one, they might get, let's call it 100 points. And these up here, they might get 75 points for that one, 85 points for that one, 95, just whatever the scheme happens to be that you have in mind. And then for the other items, they might get some points as well. And some items could be left out. So if you do it, setup like that, so now you have some points set up in there. If we look at these booth groupings, when you're operating under points, you have some other possibilities that open up to you. So I'm going to press F10 here to go back and look at our booths, our groupings for the booth. And you'll notice now that we're under the points scheme, we have some other entries have opened up out here for us. And essentially what you can do is, like under the Kisses group, you can say if you buy all 3, because we have 3 items in our Kisses group, if you buy a minimum of 3 items, and so this minimum type is always either an I for items or a Q for quantity. So if you buy a minimum of 3 items, you'll get an extra bonus of 1,000 points, something of that nature. Actually, I think that I've gone a little too high there, so let's say it's 900 points. We don't allow quite as big of a bonus in there for that. So let's do that, 900 points. And you notice it's carried out into decimal places, just like a dollar value. The main difference is this doesn't come off invoice. This is accrued for you to do something else with. Tickets for a drawing, however you arrange that in your system. So that would be the bonus if they buy 3 items. I could also have made it be, buy a minimum quantity of at least 50 of a quantity across all items in this group, and you will get a bonus of 500 points. So something of that nature. So that's a little bit about that, grouping and points and what some of the distinguishing differences are between those. And we'll show you what that looks like when we look at the actual operations in a browser, how that appears, how it's displayed, and so forth, and how you can distinguish the differences between those. So that's pretty much what we wanted to cover in this extra little session. So onward and upward, the next session will be from the browser perspective, showing how you can do some administrative type tasks, and then we'll have another session that shows what the booth operator will actually see and how they interact with the system. Thank you for listening.